Common Ground, a Prairie Podcast, is supported by a generous grant from the North Dakota Natural Resources Trust. If you would like to contribute to our on-the-ground conservation initiatives and our conservation internship and mentorship programs here in North Dakota, please consider making a donation to us through our member support link on our Spotify page. Your contributions will directly support the Walsh County Three Rivers Soil Conservation District, where this year we will plant over 10,000 trees and several hundred acres of conservation grass, pollinators, and cover crops, while also offering hands-on conservation job training to our high school and college interns. You can also support our efforts by liking, reviewing, sharing, and subscribing to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, and YouTube. Thank you. Welcome to Common Ground, a Prairie Podcast. This is your host, Josh Anderson. In this episode, we talk with folks from Ducks Unlimited about how farmers, ranchers, and landowners have been working together with conservationists to preserve grassland and wetland habitat for waterfowl, and ways that this can make their operations more profitable. The word wetlands always reminds me of duck hunting with my Uncle Bear. Belly crawling through the frosted grass, the smell of wet earth and wheat stubble, a pink burst of sunrise through the cattails, clouds rippled in the glassy water. North Dakota is considered the waterfowl capital of the world. Blue-winged teal and buffleheads, wood ducks and gadwalls, pintails and redheads, the iconic mallard and Canada goose, the blue-billed ruddy duck, and the pink and orange crowns on the heads of baby coots. Ducks, geese, and swans are one way to celebrate rural abundance in the northern Great Plains. It is a landscape carved by glaciers that left behind the prairie potholes and drift prairie, regions that fill up with water just in time for migratory waterfowl to make their breeding nests. We speak with Robert Ford, a biologist with Ducks Unlimited, who joined us at a restored wetland site in the Drift Prairie region of North Dakota. Robert explains why these small, sometimes temporary wetlands are as valuable as small towns and rural schools. We talk about the vibrant colors of waterfowl plumage and their incredible stories of endurance as the birds complete their arduous journeys across miles and miles of open sky flyways. Perhaps most important to you, our listeners, we discuss how working lands approaches to wetlands and grasslands conservation with farmers and ranchers can increase the profitability of livestock and cropland and help to grow prosperous rural communities. In our second interview, I speak with Emily Schwartz, an agronomist for Ducks Unlimited, who grew up in Mayville, a small town in rural North Dakota. I ask Emily, how rural are you? And we discover that rural is a stretchy word, a word that challenges us to think big about small places. Emily explains how she learned to look at wetlands and grasslands with the principles of soil health in mind, and to advocate for a diversity of plant species to grow resilience into the soil, as well as the rural economy. Finally, Emily and I contemplate a difficult question. Those of us who advocate for conservation and habitat restoration are often asked, how do you change people's minds? But I wanted to ask a different question. How have our own minds been changed? We hope you enjoy today's episode, Out in the Elements, the sounds of North Dakota wind and waterfowl, and the rustle of grasses along the edges of wetlands. Without further ado, let's start the show. Welcome to Common Ground, a Prairie Podcast. We are very excited today to be talking with folks from Ducks Unlimited. First up, we have Robert Ford. You're a biologist with Ducks Unlimited, and I wanted to get right into it. So I wanted to start by asking if you could describe this mitigation site here in Starkweather for our listeners.
So mitigation is just one way DU conserves and restores habitat. So we realize that we try to use best management practices to mitigate the impacts to wetland basins, but we understand that sometimes it's inevitable. So what we try to do is take pieces of property within a watershed that there's impacts to, that developers can then offset those impacts within that area. So for instance, this site right here, this is the Starkweather Mitigation Bank. This is a site where DU facilitated an agreement with the landowner where we restored these wetlands. Some of these were planted back to grass, some remain in crop, but the wetlands were restored. So there's that where the developers kind of reinvest in this, and then we can use those proceeds to take money and put those back towards our mission, primarily in the prairie pothole regions, because this is the bread and the butter for waterfowl. So on this specific site here, like I said, we partnered with the landowner, facilitated that agreement, but also there was this added component where the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service put protections on these wetlands, and then this land was enrolled into the North Dakota Game and Fish Plots program. So every acre that DU worked on this mitigation project area is enrolled into plots. It's open to public access for hunting. And then there's several WPAs that actually touch several of these boundaries, and there's several around here. So it's just, you can get to this area and kind of in the fall and get to explore the various grasslands and wetlands within the area.
And so real quick, how can landowners interested in protecting their wetlands or working or partnering with DU, I mean, what is can you just kind of walk us through the steps and how that works?
Yeah, generally these were a large number of wetland, like more acres, so we could tackle that with that mitigation program. If there's the bank, if there's offsets, if there's development within this watershed, then we could find a property like this and then develop these and then mitigate that development off site. Typically, we have a lot of these small, shallow, temporary seasonal wetlands, and those are the ones that are often impacted. And we cost share 100% of the restoring of the wetlands with our working lands programs, and that's usually simple ditch plugs, so they're not very expensive. But then you can kind of restore those basins back to what they were. Yeah.
Well, it's a thrill to be out here with you today, and I should mention it's late April. It's still pretty cold here in North Dakota. We don't have a ton of waterfowl here today, but I do see some gulls strutting up on the gravel road here. We're trying to stay out of the wind, so we're down by the water. What kinds of species do you expect to see here in terms of waterfowl in a typical migration season?
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed out that you don't see a lot, and we get a lot of that from people that are not accustomed to North Dakota, particular DU volunteers or members from southern regions where they see a lot of animals in one spot at a particular time. Obviously, they're grouped up for fall migration, and this is typical of this time of year where you may not see a lot of action. You may see a couple lone pairs or a few species on a wetland, but during this type of year, we're going to see our 5 most common dabbling duck species usually, and that's your mallards, your pintails, your northern shovelers, your gadwall, and your blue-winged teal. Those are probably the predominant ducks you'll see, with the later, the blue-winged teal being the most prolific, oh, I can't even say that word.
Prolific, I think you got.
Prolific nester in North Dakota. We ban the most of those ducks. We harvest a lot of those ducks if they're still around before they migrate. Outside of that, obviously, you'll see a lot of Canada geese. They're prolific around North Dakota, and then you may see an occasional, we saw some snow geese on the way up here, but those have moved through, and then your sandhill cranes, depending on the wetland type. So outside of that, obviously you mentioned gulls. Those seem ubiquitous here, particularly near the farm ground. But then some divers I see a lot of out here are canvasbacks and redheads, and then scaup. They're usually, during this time of year, they're making their way through.
Great. So as a biologist, I'm actually, I'm a writer, so I don't have a science background. And so I'm curious what kinds of things you notice out here. When we were walking in, I saw that you were pointing out different grasses that were growing here, this recent grass planting here. And I'm just kind of curious what kinds of things you notice this time of year as a biologist when you're coming out and kind of scouting around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly. The first thing I notice just by default are the animals, particularly ducks, because that's what we're most fascinated with. So we look, see what species are out, but not necessarily numbers, just how many of each species, but whether they're lone drakes or paired up or that kind of instance. Just that can give you an indication of what time scale they're on as far as breeding. If they're still paired up, obviously they're not nesting yet, but if you see some lone males, those are called indicated pairs, where those females could be off nesting off in the grass. So just those type of things. Then I look at the water, the wetlands, the site we're at here today. There's a bit of a mud margin, and this area, it seems every year is dry. Northeast North Dakota, and that wasn't unfamiliar last year. This was probably one of the drier spots in the state. And then I guess you've got some rain this year, so I was looking for a little bit more water, but I think we're okay right now. And they're supposed to rain today. It's supposed to rain later this week. So those are the kind of things I think about when we visit a site, birds, and then wetland conditions. And then this time of year, this specific site was planted back to grass probably within 2 to 3 years ago. So we could still see the rows of grasses that were planted. We could see, usually you see these mare's tails and these weeds. They're pretty prominent the first couple of years. When we plant grass, we often get asked, should we manage that? Should we hay that? What should we do? And for my predecessor, the one I learned from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, it'd be best if you just planted it and walked away for like 3 years, 4 years. It could take 5 years for this to establish at least, because it's mostly natives, warm and cool season natives, I imagine, and it's going to take some time to establish. So this is typical of a recent grass planting. There's no fence around here. That's another thing I kind of look at. We try to manage these grassland landscapes with cattle, and potentially we could have that in the future depending on what the landowner desires. But and it could be hayed as well. But so this is pretty typical of a grass planting, but this is what we need in North Dakota, grass and wetlands.
Yeah, and you mentioned that it's supposed to rain today. It's rained the last couple of days. You guys were teasing me about my pickup being real muddy when I got it here.
It was white, I assume, before.
It used to be white,
your trip out here,
but I've been doing a little bit of ranching and work up in Walsh County. And so I guess, but it was also really, really dry all winter. It was a very, very dry winter, and we just had 2 really big windstorms in our neck of the woods, one on Earth Day and one the day before Arbor Day, and then kind of mercifully we got the rain. How do waterfowl adapt to that kind of extreme between drought and wetlands, I guess?
Yeah. So this is probably nothing new for waterfowl, right? They've been doing these things for thousands and thousands of years, and will continue to do them for thousands and thousands of years if we still have the habitat in that time frame. But I think about dry conditions. We had a major drought cycle come through. 2 years ago was probably the worst we've seen in a long time. And when these waterfowl migrate through, dry conditions, they probably continue farther. If there's wet conditions before here, they could stop. Teal would stop in South Dakota to set up shop there, but a lot of times they just make their way through, and if there's not adequate moisture, because wetlands are what bring these waterfowl to this area. So they would continue on in that journey. If they do stay, if there's water, but it's a particularly dry year, there's potential that they would not re-nest as much. So that's kind of one of the strategies that these dabbling ducks have come up with, is this re-nesting, where given there's wet enough conditions, if their first nest failures, and we often think that 15% nest success is enough to sustain a duck population, a species. So that's relatively low. So they don't need much success to keep their numbers stagnant. But as it's wetter, their coping mechanism, if they lose nest to predation, which is usually the case, they'll keep re-nesting, and mallards will re-nest up to 5 or 6 times.
Wow.
And granted, their fecundity, the likelihood of producing a brood is less likely as they re-nest more, and then their broods are smaller, obviously, as they go on. But in a dry year, the propensity to re-nest just isn't there. They might nest once, and if it fails, they won't produce a brood that year. So if they do that here and that becomes a situation, you can see a reduction in population through that. If they continue north and it's also dry there, they could also forego nesting altogether, which is seen more so, I think, with the divers. But that's a consequence of dry conditions. And when it's wet, it's boom.
Wow.
So they produce a lot of birds when it's wet because some of those strategies there.
Yeah. I'm really in awe of migratory waterfowl. I mean, I'm curious to kind of ask a two-part question here. I've heard North Dakota referred to as the duck factory of the nation, maybe even of the world. And so first part is, what makes North Dakota so prominent for a waterfowl? And then the second question is, just how far are some of these birds traveling, and what kinds of things do they endure over that stretch?
Yeah, great question. And some people probably don't realize that a lot of these ducks nest in grass, but it's two things primarily. It's going to be your grass, but your wetlands. That's what draws ducks to this area. And you're right, North Dakota produces the most birds in the United States here, contiguous United States, and because of this abundance of wetlands and grasslands, historically, when the glaciers retreated 9 to 12,000 years ago, is in such a manner that they carved out these small depressional basins, wetland basins, and then you intermix that with tallgrass prairie in the east, transitioning to more of a mixed grass towards the west. I mean, it's just abundant grasslands intermixed with these small, often shallow wetlands, and that's what they're keying in on. So these temporary or seasonal wetlands, as we call them, they're the first to thaw. The first readily available for these birds that sit on water, right? They're waterfowl. And the reason that they're so attracted to this, because it's a proxy for what they're after, and that's food. So that's mostly aquatic invertebrates. There's other things like snails and seeds and like that, but so they offer the first available water and food resources. They're void of predators. There's not going to be any predators in these small, we're talking less than 1 acre, half acre, quarter acre section or size wetlands. And the predation thing could become an issue later on the year as they transition from these smaller wetland areas to larger bodies of water, potentially that hold fish. I get pictures from producers sometimes that went fishing for a particular day and they cut open their northern pike and there's a whole brood of ducks in there, So that's just some of the consequences of rearing a brood on larger areas. But the biggest thing outside of that is ducks are territorial. So, and what that means is you have a pond like this in back of us here, a fairly sized pond here, temporary or a semi-permanent might be here, but so you could get a situation where you have a mallard pair set up on this. So the female comes in and she sets up a feeding territory on this wetland, and the male, let's just say mallard, comes in and he protects that female from other males of the same species. So he's going to defend from other males of the mallard family, but not necessarily against males of other species like a blue-winged teal or a gadwall, etc., etc. So you could have 10 of these wetlands in here, and you could have 10 pairs of mallards on them, 10 pairs of blue-winged teal, 10 pairs of blue-winged teal, did I say that? Or pintail, excuse me. Rather, if you consolidated all these wetlands into one large wetland, there's probably going to be some fighting within species, so your mallards will defend against your mallards. not saying there won't be more than a pair of mallards, but there's research that's shown, our director has conducted some of this research that shows that 10 1-acre ponds supports 3 times as many breeding pairs as one 10-acre pond. It's just because of that territoriality issue. So you could see how the smaller wetlands can support more waterfowl than one larger wetland, just because of the territoriality issue there.
So is that also then what makes like the prairie pothole region so important for waterfowl production? The kind of scattering of small ponds.
Yeah, exactly. Why? There's some people that thinks that these small temporary wetlands within a crop field can be detrimental for their operation, and we could just consolidate those and build a bigger one on the corner that's twice as deep, twice as big, and it doesn't work that way. The wetland doesn't work that way because of the territoriality issue. We're going to lose out a bunch of nesting activity just because of that. So if you zoom out and look at the aerial imagery of North Dakota, and primarily the Missouri Coteau, as you call it, anywhere from west of Jamestown through Medina, up through Wing, and then towards Minot and Crosby, you could just see there's the Missouri Coteau, the rolling hills, the landscape, and all these wetlands intermixed through all of that. And we're here now, and we call it the drift prairie, so it's not as much rolling hills, but it's still a very vital, important area for breeding waterfowl. But you're exactly right, just because of the dynamic of different type of wetlands, but mostly those small, shallow wetlands. I mean, those are what really draw the waterfowl in. And it doesn't matter if they're in grasslands or croplands; those are just as important as these ones in grasslands as well. Because without those, it could be like dry conditions. You could have a few set up here and there, but most of them, there's no water available, so they're going to move on.
So when I'm out here and I feel the wind come off a pond like this, and my extremities getting red and cold, I feel like I should be belly crawling up to this with my Uncle Bear and my grandfather. It looks like a place that we would have gone hunting. And that's part of where my passion for some of conservation comes from, is from that really deep background of being with uncles, cousins, my grandfather out on pieces of ground hunting. I'm curious, where does your passion for this kind of work come from?
Yeah, it's similar, but I actually didn't grow up. I'm probably unique amongst our employees, as I didn't actually grow up hunting a lot. My father was a fisherman and didn't hunt, so we did a lot of fishing. And it wasn't until I was much older and undergraduate school, basically, that I started to delve in. But it's the same type of deal where you go out one time and you're out before the sunset, before the birds are flying. And in your case, you're ready and waiting, and then you see some flying, or you hear some either goose calling, or you hear ducks starting to make noises, and that does something. And you see the sunrise, and you see all the other animals. With me specifically, I actually did a lot of waterfowl trapping back in school, and you get the same kind of feeling when we did a lot of rocket netting. So it's similar to hunting in a way that you prepare the site on a wetland, let's say like this, but you arrive before the birds, you set up all the equipment, then you kind of retreat to a blind, and then you wait and you stay quiet, which is not always the case with hunting. That's a good thing about duck hunting, is you don't have to be super quiet. You just have to be hidden. Same thing with that, or you're hide, and with that we did have to be quiet, but you start to hear we did a lot of wood duck banding in the south that way, and there's something about being up before the birds, but then hearing them rise, and then it's the same kind of, excitement that you get from hunting. We weren't shooting birds, we were shooting a rocky net to capture birds, but it's the same type of feeling. And then obviously being out hunting, there's something about when you can be out with the birds coming into your decoy spread, and when they put their feet down, their landing gear down, and wings cupped to come in. I don't know if there's anything really like it.
Yeah. Well, on a day like today, this transition to talking about color might not be the the easiest for us. We got what I call a North Dakota blue sky today. It's very gray, and we're still waiting for the real kind of bloom to see in the grasslands that we have surrounding this pond here. But when I was out at Kelly's Slough with Mike Jacobs, we ended up having a conversation about bird plumages and how vibrant the colors are. And I'm curious, like, what's your favorite waterfowl plumage and why?
Oh, that's always a tough question. The first bird, really all of them, but the first bird, I guess if I had to pick one, the first bird that comes to mind is the wood duck. Not that you see much of that in North Dakota, but just the complexity of the plumage. And obviously we're talking about drakes here because they're the colorful ones and ducks, but the tuft of the head and the iridescence, just everything about it is just beautiful. And really, I don't know if any of them aren't fantastic in their own way. And an example of that is the gadwall, which to many might seem very drab. I mean, looks similar to the hen, but it's got differences. But there might be, I think there's something beautiful in the simplicity of the gadwall as well. Particularly, and I don't know if you see this much in North Dakota, a lot of when we harvest our birds here, they're still in, I call it basic plumage. They're transitioning over until they're alternate or breeding plumage. And you see more of that during the end of the hunting season. But gadwalls in the south, in their hunting seasons, they'll get this purplish hue on their head. So I think even the gadwall is beautiful. Having said that, there's, you could see birds off the side of the road and they look bright and colorful. Like, let's take a mallard, for instance. It just looks like a green head, but I think you really have to hold the bird in hand to kind of see some of this, the beauty in this. And that whether that's if you have the opportunity to hold a duck for whatever reason for banding, or if you harvest one and you get the right light, there's so much iridescence just in that mallard head. There's different colors of blues, purples, greens that you don't see when you see it off the road. And it kind of reminds me if you walk through the mall or whatever and you see those kiosks in the middle, they have the paintings of the random guy, but if you change direction, it turns into a skeleton or something. I don't know if that makes any sense, but there's transitional photos. It's kind of like the way you turn a duck's head, you pick out almost every color in the dang rainbow.
Yeah, I mean, they catch light in such spectacular ways. I mean, and it really is a magnificent display of color. The waterfowl, I mean, I'm kind of partial. This is a little bit of a cheat because it's not plumage, but I love the blue bill of the ruddy duck. That's just so amazing. It's such an interesting color to see out here. I guess one of the questions that I have for you is, I've told this story in previous episodes about how I got the Merlin app and I got really excited about starting to be able to identify birds by bird song. And I don't know if there's as much of that with waterfowl, but I'm curious, I guess, do you have any idea what they're saying? How important is the call of waterfowl? What do they use that for, and what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, my first thought is always like, people tell you what they mean. Like, could we ever really know? But to some degree. But what I think, I'll just think about the Canada goose, because it's, for me, the outside snow geese, the most vocal bird that you always hear around here, and I liken it to almost, and maybe this isn't fair, but like Navy, or like fighter pilots. So first, when they're on the water, you can hear them when they wake up, and they're vocalizing, and I believe that's to get organized, because they're often loudest right before they get up in unison. So they want to get up in unison and make sure everybody's ready to go. I believe that's what they're doing. And then when they're in flight, I kind of, again, reference like a fighter pilot group, like Blue Angels or something, they're flying in unison, and they're using those vocalizations to keep in formation. They fly in the V formation, right? And most waterfowl species do that for aerodynamic purposes, but they're going to use vocalizations to kind of coordinate the direction they're going, movements they need to make. They're often, I guess, the lead goose or bird is kind of responsible for navigating, and then but they'll switch out So they're using vocalizations to do that. So on their journey, they're just, it's constant communication, I believe, direction, make sure they're all on the same page, mid-flight adjustments, that kind of thing. And then you kind of wonder, like, why this wetland or why this spot in the wetlands, particularly when you're hunting, right? Mm-hmm. Like, you're set up here, you got your decoys here, and they fly out and land in the middle of the water, and some of those might do it silently, but of course they could use vocalizations to, hey, watch out, there's a guy over there hiding in the cat, or a gal hiding in the cattails. Yeah. So I think it's a lot like we would communicate if we're doing anything, trying to get a mission accomplished through coordination. It's just that type of sounds come out.
It occurs to me that I want to come back to the working lands approaches that you've talked about in relation to Ducks Unlimited and some of the ways that you guys are working with ranchers, with landowners, with farmers, even on your own team. We're here with you, a biologist, an agronomist, a communications person. So you have to do a lot of communicating across these different lines, and each person and each kind of demographic has a different interpretation of what a best management practice is or what the best use of the land is. Do you have anything to say, or can you kind of help us to understand how that communication and collaboration works in a working lands approach to land protection and water protection?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'll just start off with most of the land in North Dakota is privately held. Like over 93%, and we realize that Ducks Unlimited has different strategies for different portions of the country they're in. So there's DU Canada, DU United States, DU Mexico, and within the United States we do very drastically different things. In the Northern Plains and North Dakota specifically, our best strategy for our mission is to work and partner with landowners to do a couple things. The primary objective is to conserve, restore habitat, manage habitat for, wildlife. But equally as important is to increase the profitability and sustainability of an operation, because without that farmer rancher and their livestock, the needs for grasslands on the landscape is severely diminished. And we believe that cows are a great thing for the environment, and obviously where there's cows, there's going to be ducks because there's grass, and there's usually intact wetlands in these areas. So it's very important for us to partner with landowners that are willing to, and most of them are. They're very good stewards of the land. They, as much as us, realize that their livelihood depends on the production of their ground. So why wouldn't they want to enhance it? And that's our main objective, is to help them enhance their lands. So as far as communicating, I don't know if you mean something like, whatever works. We're very flexible the way we work. Just like today, I wanted to make it easy on you. If you were a landowner, I wouldn't want you to drive all the way to Bismarck, North Dakota. I would meet you out at we'd meet on your land. We'd look at your grass or your crop land, look at your equipment, and we kind of figure out to see if your objectives are in line with ours. And we work with a lot of holistic management practices, people doing these types of things, soil health principles. That's what we're interested in doing. So it doesn't, we have a priority area, but you could be in the highest priority area and still degrade your land. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's the best position for us to work with that producer at that time. So it's really a lot about how a producer sees their land and sees where they're going in the future, and what their objectives are, and how and if those align with what we're trying to do.
Yeah, one of the things that I like about the medium of the podcast, even as the host, is that it really challenges me to be a listener, and that ties right in with our work in our soil conservation district, and it sounds very similar to what you guys do with Ducks Unlimited. And I guess the other thing that I think about when I think of a working lands approach, the reason we call this common ground is that's what we're seeking, really. Common ground across this range of conservation interests, ranching and farming operation interests, and how important profitability is for ranching operations and farming operations to stay in business. But when we work together, we can grow something beyond profit, and that's value, and that's something that we've been trying to sell in our neck of the woods anyway, and it's starting to catch on, I think, is that we're not at odds with each other. We're actually working on the same issues, and maybe if we're at odds with anything, it's North Dakota weather. It's trying to kind of manage the challenges of the ecosystem itself, which can really humble us pretty easily.
Yeah, but the beauty in it, and it seems almost too good to be true, and I'm skeptical of things that seem to be too good to be true, but this honestly feels like it's better for the producer, it's better for the animals, and it's better for people who, whether you use the land for consumptive uses or not, it kind of works out that it benefits everybody. So why would we not try to do this type of thing? And I think, historically it was smaller, more numerous operations that kind of had all the tools in their tool bag. I mean, they did a little farming, they did a little ranching, but they ran multiple species on their acres. They did as much as they could on their small little, let's say 40 or 80 acres. And unfortunately, it's getting to a point where it's the opposite. And I think that there's a potential to lose conservation ethic at that point. So not that they couldn't still have that conservation ethic, but you're right, there's no reason why we can't all work together. I think you're exactly right that we're in it for the same thing.
Next up, we talk with Emily Schwartz, an agronomist with Ducks Unlimited, on the banks of a wetland near Starkweather, North Dakota. We are delighted today to be talking not only with Robert Ford of Ducks Unlimited, but also Emily Schwartz, and you are an agronomist with Ducks Unlimited, is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah, that's great. Okay. So I'm curious, I asked Robert as a biologist what he notices when he's out here, but what do you notice as an agronomist being out on a spot like this at the Starkweather mitigation site?
In my role as an agronomist on the conservation programs team for Ducks Unlimited, I've been training myself and learning how to look at landscapes through the eyes and the soil health principles. And so looking around, I guess really briefly, the soil health principles are minimize soil disturbance, maximize living root in the ground, maximize plant diversity, animal diversity, and maximize soil cover. So looking around here, we see that we're in a perennial area mitigation site, and there's quite a bit of different plants as we look around. Some taller, some shorter, some greening up, some not quite greening up yet. So that tells me there's a lot of diversity out here. We didn't see any fence posts, so we look around for fence posts for that livestock integration, but not quite yet anyway.
And what makes diversity of plant life so important to soil health? It's always been a kind of curiosity of mine. Why is it so important to have diverse root systems, diverse different kinds of plants, and how does that translate into soil health?
Yeah, it's important because it makes the grasslands more resilient and home to more biodiversity. Those are some of the ways. Also, you have your cool season and your warm season grasses. Right now you hear a lot about cool season grasses invading the native grasslands. So when you plant a mitigation site, having more diversity will help to mitigate that as well. And they're functioning different at different times of the year. So when we look on the bigger landscape, we might see a lot of the brome grass and the road ditches greening up right away, and it's kind of all homogeneous, all the same stage and same plants likely, or at least same system to the same kind of benefit to the environments. But when you have the diversity, then you'll have more.
Sure.
More.
Yeah, and my understanding, there's more microbial life with more diversity in the soil, right? And then also with diversity of those different seasons, cool season and warm season. I imagine that that's good for different kinds of bird species, pollinating species that arrive at different times of the year and are expecting that food to be there, you know?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yep, so it would fall under the having a living root in the ground longer and throughout the year, not just maybe 60 or 90 days.
Yeah.
And I guess that's what.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, and so today I'm rocking my Park River Aggie football hoodie, which I sometimes still wear. And so that means I grew up in Park River, North Dakota, which is in Walsh County, and lots of family from Walsh County in that region. I understand that you grew up in Trail County, so I want to, how rural are you? Like, what was your graduating high school class or something like that, I guess?
Yeah.
And what did growing up in rural Trail County teach you that you still use today? Like, how does that translate into being an agronomist for Ducks Unlimited today?
Great. I graduated from Mayville, so you might have played them in football.
Yeah, definitely, and basketball. Yeah, they were very good back then. So.
Yeah, and my graduating class was maybe a little bit larger than most of the other small towns of North Dakota, of about 50. So what was yours?
Mine was about 30.
Okay,
so yeah. Rural is kind of on a spectrum when we're in North Dakota, you know.
Definitely.
So, So I'm just curious, what did growing up in Mayville, Trail County, growing up rural, how does that translate into being an agronomist today?
Yeah, I know you sent us these questions ahead of time, so I was trying to think of a good answer for that one too. Well, first of all, I had a really great education, I would say, in a small town. So they really taught us how to critically think about things and be curious, ask questions, and kind of really instilled that love of learning. And I got that from my parents as well. So that would be one thing that I picked up in a rural community and brought with me when I went to NDSU afterwards. And like you said, being rural is kind of on a spectrum. That's where I met a lot of people from even smaller schools than the one I went to as well. And I think just spending a lot of time in the outdoors. Maybe when I was younger, I wasn't quite sure what a career in the outdoors would mean. You know, I knew what I saw around me, a lot of farmers and agronomists. But I was also curious to see what else was out there. Yeah. And so when I went to NDSU, I majored in natural resource management with a minor in crop and weed science. Another kind of story, or how rural are you, I guess, and I know podcasts can kind of reach a wide audience, it was about a 15-mile drive from where I lived to where I went to school. 5 miles on gravel roads and 10 on highway. Really got to see the landscape level of Trail County. There's quite a bit of row crops then, corn, beans, and wheat. Yeah,
and I imagine a lot of your work is communicating with rural people. I mean, communicating to some degree with people that are farmers, ranchers. This kind of leads into the question that I have for you on DU's cover crop and livestock integration program. Can you tell us a little bit about that program, first of all? Like, describe what that means, and then how do cover crops and livestock work together in soil health?
Definitely. The cover crop and livestock integration program is a program, I say, is for farmers and ranchers that are ready to implement all of those principles of soil health that we talked a little bit about earlier. So usually the farmers and ranchers are ready to implement all or most of them on their land. So with that program, they're able to cost share fence and water infrastructure on cropland, and it also cost shares cover crops. So then you're able to get the plant diversity out there on the cropland, animal integration, and keep cover on the soil and invest into your soils.
Yeah. One of the things that our office often stresses about the value of something like a cover crop and livestock integration program is that it really mimics how the soils formed in the first place, with this being a tall grass and mixed grass prairie with bison and elk and deer and other species that graze grass. And so in some ways it seems like DU is kind of a proponent of bringing back grassland habitat at the same time as keeping it a working lands kind of approach. I guess this leads to my next question, which is, I'm still learning about how in ecology everything is connected, right? How would you describe the connection between cover crops and livestock integration and the lives of ducks and geese and other kinds of waterfowl?
Definitely. At Ducks Unlimited, we have designed our working lands programs, not just the cover crop and livestock integration program, but our more traditional grassland programs, to help manage the habitat on a landscape level. So, for example, with the cover crop and livestock integration program, when the livestock are on that cropland grazing a cover crop, that is giving more rest and recovery time to the grasslands kind of associated with that operation. And that'll help build more resilient grasslands and habitat.
Great. So in my role, and maybe in yours as well, I often get asked, how can we change people's minds about things like conservation? However, I like to turn this question back around on myself and ask, how has my own mind been changed? You know, I grew up in rural North Dakota. I was a bulldozer operator and a truck driver in big farm operations. And then later, through a circuitous route, I went on to be a professor of American literature. And so I'm curious, if you have an example about how your own relationship to land or wildlife or the agricultural community has changed in subtle or significant ways.
Yeah, I think my answer to this question is kind of, it might go along well with my career development, like you mentioned. After high school, I was kind of like, what should I do? I decided to go to North Dakota State University. I knew I wanted to do something in the outdoors, but there were still a lot of careers out there I didn't know much about, and so I definitely would say through classes and through job experience. I also worked for a soil conservation district for a summer.
Cool.
I worked in research through NDSU in rangeland research and also more traditional agronomy research. I guess I'm leading up some background information to the mindset change. I also I think, being a younger person, we used to, with my peers, we didn't maybe appreciate North Dakota's natural resources as much. We would go to Minnesota a lot and be like, why don't we have trees and lakes like Minnesota, or why don't we have mountains and trees like Montana? But through my job experiences and classes and meeting more hunters, I actually don't have a hunting background either, so I'm a newer hunter too. I began to make more connections with the landscape of North Dakota, whether that be learning more plant ID. So when you go out on hikes, you can see all the different wildflowers, learning about the importance of pollinators and all of the variety. You know, I used to just think there was a monarch butterfly. You know, I didn't know anything about skippers or any of the other butterflies and bees native to North Dakota. And birds too, birds and waterfowl. Like I said, I wasn't really a hunter, so I'd see some birds at the bird feeder, but other than that, I didn't pay too much attention to it. And I would almost have called myself plant blind as a younger person, you know, like way younger, in high school or younger. But so as you gain these like experiences with the outdoors, and that would be kind of how I did have that subtle shift into like realizing what a natural treasure we had here in North Dakota with our biodiversity resources and plants and animals. And
Yeah, no, I think that's a fantastic answer. And what it reminds me of when you are reminiscing about growing up as a rural youth, talking with your friends, not being able to really appreciate North Dakota. Yeah. At least for me, it felt like the option was to farm or leave, mm-hmm. And so for me, I chose that second route, or it was sort of chosen for me. I left. Yeah. But like a migratory waterfowl, my return trip has been so fulfilling in being able to see the land in such a different way, right? So the leaving and returning has been really crucial for me in the changing of mindset. It took 20 years, but I think that I have had that kind of profound change in how I see things. The other thing is, as a young person, I thought I knew everything, and in my position today, I'm well aware of how much I don't know, and how much there is to know. You're mentioning all these pollinating species, and I feel I interviewed Naeem Kalwar, who's a soil health specialist out of the NDSU Extension Research Center in Langdon, and he grew up in Pakistan. His dad was an agronomist, a professor of agronomy, and so he's been around soil his whole life. And he told me during that interview, Josh, I don't know how other people see it, but I think I know less than 1% about soil. And if someone in his position who's been around soil his whole life still thinks there's 99% more to know about soil, that means I have a long way to go to learn everything, right? And so with that, for me, with that kind of recognition of how much there is still to learn, it actually, I hope, opens up that kind of common ground approach to be able to learn with others, as opposed to thinking we're the carriers of knowledge and we know it all and we're going to teach you how to do it. Yeah. It's more, there's a lot to learn about soil health, right? Definitely.
Oh, definitely. That's an understatement, yes.
Right? Yeah.
And like you said, it opens up a whole new world to you, too. Within, I guess I didn't leave for 20 years, but just being here and then realizing what is here opens up a whole new world as well.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of Common Ground, a Prairie Podcast. We'd like to thank today's guests, Robert Ford and Emily Schwartz of Ducks Unlimited, for joining us. Special thanks to Matthew Connolly for producing our theme music, and to Crista Fiala for sound editing today's episode. Until next time, this is Josh Anderson, signing off for Common Ground, a Prairie Podcast. Common Ground, a Prairie Podcast, is supported by a generous grant from the North Dakota Natural Resources Trust. If you would like to contribute to our on-the-ground conservation initiatives and our conservation internship and mentorship programs here in North Dakota, please consider making a donation to us through our member support link on our Spotify page. Your contributions will directly support the Walsh County Three Rivers Soil Conservation District, where this year we will plant over 10,000 trees and several hundred acres of conservation grass, pollinators, and cover crops, while also offering hands-on conservation job training to our high school and college interns. You can also support our efforts by liking, reviewing, sharing, and subscribing to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, and YouTube. Thank you.